So if you're joining today in the Zoom room, you can go ahead and ask a question at any time via the Q&A function. And if you're watching on YouTube, there's a chat function there. We'll check that out once we get to the Q&A portion of today's webcast. And if you're watching on YouTube, if you could just give me a like, I appreciate it. It goes a long way, and consider subscribing. This is the content that you can get on this channel, and we look forward to having more of it in the future. So today I'm coming to you virtually from the entrance to the sports book at Aria. Over on the left as you walk in is 550 Pizza, a very good pizza. And actually, before you get to 550 Pizza, there's a bar right there, and it's actually one of my favorite bars in Vegas. As bars go, it's not too fancy. There's some sports TVs up top, and you can watch some of the games. It's not as good as being in the sports book, but what I like about it is there's a decent video poker play there. They have a decent return on $5 denomination video poker, and the bartenders are really friendly. There's one that does a little bit of a stickler when it comes to comping you drinks. His name's Tyrone. Big guy, white hair, barrel-chested. Here's my tip for you. He's a huge Chicago Bears fan. Just say the Bears, and he goes on and on and on, and he's your best friend for as long as you're sitting there. So that's a little tip for you. So today we're going to talk about 5 mistakes that you can make, 5 mistakes that bettors make when they're handicapping sports. And the reason we're going to talk about this is so these are mistakes that you can avoid in making them. So we'll get started here. Let's first talk about why you need this, why you need to avoid mistakes like this, because it's very important. And one of the keys is that, sorry, a little distracted. Okay, one of the keys here is that a lot of people approach sports betting as if it was a money tree, okay? And realistic or not, a lot of people think this is the easy way to go. They can just, whenever they feel like predicting the outcome of a game or an event, they can just go pluck some money off the money tree. In reality, though, you're here, just below the money tree. It's sort of within your reach. But here's where handicapping the NFL is on the money tree. It's way up top, and it's not so easy to get to. And that's the kind of the paradox that a lot of people don't realize when they approach sports betting is, yes, there are different ways to approach sports betting. There are different methods you can use to get some money. But handicapping is actually one of the tougher things you can do, raw handicapping, when it comes to sports betting. And especially if you're choosing a major sport, and even more so if you're choosing a sport that has a high efficiency, such as the NFL. English Premier League soccer is another example of a high efficiency betting market. In other words, there's not too much here to pick off the tree when it comes to sports betting. So what do? Well, too often bettors believe that they can overcome this in some way. And that's the first mistake that bettors make, is believing that you can handicap sports effectively and profitably. The harsh reality is that effective and efficient handicapping is very time intensive. It's a complicated process. And if you're waking up on Sunday morning and checking the lines and stats a couple hours before the NFL games start, well, you're fooling yourself that you can beat the NFL sides and totals. I'm not saying that handicapping a major US sport like the NFL is impossible. But if you believe you can do it without identifying where the inefficiencies might exist, then you're believing a lie. Handicapping in a sport is the least objective method of beating sports. What that means is that it's very results driven. If you have a relatively small sample size, like you would in the NFL, you can definitely be breathing your own exhaust when it comes to your process in beating sports. You're subject to confirmation bias when you do this. You're just far too willing to psychologically to focus on the good events, as few as they may be, in proving your theory. In other words, handicapping a major sport can often lead you down a path of basically coin flipping. And there you're living a life with no discernible edge, and you're just letting the VIG grind you down game after game, season after season, year after year, even if you believe you're a winning bettor. So, well, what do you do with that? Well, you work smarter, not harder. If you haven't watched the episode I did a few weeks back, 5 ways to work smarter, not harder, you really should. There were a lot of ideas in there for breaking sports betting down into something more manageable for you. And in this case specifically, you find lower hanging fruit on that money tree. For instance, if you're approaching the NFL just a couple hours before game time, you should be looking for surprises in the inactive list, for instance. That's the list of who's active and inactive for today's games. It comes out a couple hours before kickoff, and it's usually the last bit of unfactored information that gets put into the betting market. You could also look to play line moves when compared to a sharp book. You could probably play player props at that hour because most of those are posted day of game. See, there's plenty of ways to approach sports betting that aren't direct handicapping that you can still do given your time constraints or given the period of information that you have when you're approaching your handicapping. But on the whole, keeping up with handicapping through an entire week, especially when you deal with like the NFL, is just too large of a task for a lot of bettors, too large of a task given the amount of time they can put into it. So the next mistake that bettors make when handicapping sports is they ignore the market. Now, I got a question for you. Who is the best performing tout of all time? It's not Vegas Dave. It's not Fezzik. I'll give you a hint here. It's the market. The market is undefeated. Well, it's not undefeated, but it hasn't had a losing year in decades, and it never will, because the market is basically just the sum total of all the knowledge of the entire sports betting world. You often hear the media say something like, oh, Vegas knows, or Vegas got it right when a game lands close to the line. Well, as a matter of fact, Vegas knows very little. The market knows. Vegas has very little to do with shaping the market. It's shaped by sharp bettors. It's even shaped sometimes by public bettors around the world. The problem is you don't know who the market likes before the bet is made. So you can only get that information afterwards. So following the market in terms of choosing the bets you're going to make and try to wager on is just not possible. You'll always be getting the worst of it that way. When we're dealing with very thin margins, it's very tough to overcome that. And in this case, if you're betting just chasing the steam of the market, well, you're getting slightly worse lines. And you've probably all heard me talk about touts in the past. Well, a tout often succeeds by having a number that you can't attain. They may bet a line at -4, and by the time you get to it, it's -6.5. And if you go ahead and bet into that, well, that's just a poor choice on your part. And meanwhile, the tout gets to grade his action at the -4, and there's just enough difference there that he probably looks like he wins long term, whereas all of his followers just get the worst of it. So beyond that, you need to know the market, you need to respect the market, you need to believe the market. The market for each sport is different, though, and each sports market has inflection points. And this may be a good video topic for some time down the line. But remember what I said about the NFL inactive list, how it comes out just a couple hours before the game starts. That's an inflection point. Injury reports that come out on Thursday and Friday, that's an inflection point. Opening lines coming out on Sunday night, the week before the game, that's an inflection point. The head coach's press conference on Monday morning, another inflection point. You see, there's a lot of times when the market is going to act and react and move based on these inflection points that are going to be data inputs into the overall market. And you need to know all of this. And I'm just talking the NFL right here. You need to know it for every sport that you bet. And that's one of the reasons why I'm a fan of not trying to bet all the sports all the time. Focus on your 1 or 2 sports. and then know what the inflection points are of that sport. If you're a hockey bettor, you got to know when you're going to know who the starting goalie is going to be. And if you're waiting for lineups to come out some hour or two before the game, you're wasting your time. You need to know what the beat writer saw at practice that morning, at the morning skate around for that team. It goes on, and you really need to know your sport. And part of that, when you know the market inflection points, is now you know the market. You know when the market is going to move. So the next mistake that bettors make is trusting trends. Now, honestly, this whole section of the webcast comes down to one key tenet of data science. And I'm going to put it in all caps, big, bold red letters so that you don't forget it. And that is, correlation does not imply causation. If you've ever studied science in any way, hopefully they've stressed this, because this is key, and a lot of people miss this when analyzing data of all kinds, not just sports data, but life in general, as that correlation does not imply causation. So for instance, here is something that is completely factual, using verifiable data, and that is that there is a strong correlation between the number of people who drown by falling into a pool and the number of films that Nicolas Cage appears in each year. It's a strong correlation. There's no doubt about it, but it's a very weak causation. You can't make a reasonable case as to why there is a correlation here that exists, other than it being just a coincidence along the random walk of the universe. I know somebody's going to try to come up with a theory that, watching Nick Cage in a movie makes you just want to go headlong into a pool. Possibly. Maybe you drink too much watching his movies and then you fall in the pool. I don't know. The point being is you got to beware of believing just a narrative. Football, both college and pro, seems to be the king of narrative handicapping. We get fed stats about historical team performance when the historical data isn't even between the lineups of the two current teams. We're told narratives about team performance based on the time of day, the day of the week the game is on, everything. Anytime you're presented with a narrative or trend to consider, you should really stop and think yourself through the scientific method. Now, we all learned the scientific method in grade school. Specifically, it was teaching us to observe and then dig deeper into the information before basing a hypothesis on what you discover. There are trends that do have some validity to them. For instance, a team playing with extended rest is generally more prepared than a team playing on short rest. It's not hard to see why that is. You don't have to dig too deep to figure out why that would be. However, don't make the mistake of basing your handicapping on trends that don't have an explainable hypothesis behind them. It's a lazy way to handicap, and it can lead you down to some very poor habits. Now, in terms of mistakes that bettors make when handicapping sports, I think one that they kind of should get a pass on, and it's a little bit more excusable, is the amount of time it takes when handicapping sports. And most recreational bettors simply lack the time that is needed to put into these sports. So it makes sense that one of the key mistakes that we need to review here is that you probably lack the time to handicap correctly. Now, in terms of sports betting and time, sports betting is 25% preparation and 75% execution. A popular phrase that I like to use is that there is a science of sports betting and there is an art of sports betting. So the science is applied in that preparation phase. However, the art is a big factor in the execution of beating sports. I'm sure there are potential handicappers out there that have the ability to get the edge on sports wagering, but lack the time to do it effectively and time the market and beat the market. They probably lack the time to shop lines, maintain the number of outs that they need in order to get the money down. They lack the key resources in the endeavor. And time is probably the most key resource that they lack. As we discussed, there are workarounds for this. So whether that is shifting your focus into other forms of sports betting that fit your schedule better, or perhaps even exploring working with other people, division of labor, for instance, is a good way to overcome the resource drain that sports betting can be. I mentioned this in previous episodes about networking with people, finding ways to find like minds who are looking to make similar bets so you can share the resources, the handicapping necessary to get the bets down and make the money. Another useful tool to make better use of your schedule, to make better use of your time, is to schedule your time. Planning out your time, handicapping in advance will help you adhere to a time schedule that you can manage. There's another tip from an earlier webcast that Rufus Peabody gave us. And he said, when you're working, be working. And when you're not working, don't be working. The more you focus on what you can give to your handicapping, and the more you give all of your focus to it, the more you'll get done in the time you allot to that task. So consider everything involved with sports betting and handicapping process, and make sure that you understand that it is definitely time intensive and you need to find that time in your schedule to do it effectively. So the fifth mistake that a lot of bettors make when handicapping sports is they lack discipline. Now, discipline is an underrated trait of all successful bettors. It's actually a trait of all successful professional gamblers in general, in any form of gambling. We exist in a world where the advantage is sometimes shifting between the player and the house. And finding that advantage is often necessary in keeping up with everything about what you're doing and how you're doing it. And it can be the difference between a winning bettor and a losing bettor. We're working with very thin margins here. And this isn't just about chasing losses and trying to be disciplined that way, or wanting to end your week with a win. It's different than that. It's more about the culmination of everything that we've talked about so far in this presentation. Discipline is about making the right bets, not the most popular bets. It's about identifying the proper timing and pulse of a market. It's about knowing what narratives matter and which ones do not. And it's about having the time and the game plan to make all of this work cohesively together. So in the end, handicapping is really tough, and you need to make sure that you go at it with a prepared mind. There's a lot of people that think that handicapping is the easy money. And we've all heard that phrase, it's a hard way to make an easy living. Well, it is absolutely true. And trust me, take it from somebody who has attempted to do it for a long time. And I feel like I've been successful in doing it. But at the same time, is this easier than working a 9-to-5 job? I don't know, probably not. Do I love this more than working a 9-to-5 job? Definitely. I mean, you have to love what you do. But at the same time, you can't look at this and say, oh, I can beat the NFL, I can beat the NBA. I think you can win at sports betting. You just have to pick your spots. And if you have all the time in the world, and if you have the drive and the focus and the desire and the discipline to do it effectively, that'll bear itself out. You're going to find that. However, if you find that you're rushing into things and it's 6 o'clock on the East Coast and you're trying to get bets down for the 7 o'clock games, you might not be doing this in the right way. You might not have thought this through all the way. And that doesn't mean you can't bet sports. You certainly can, but you might want to change your focus. You might want to shift to something different. Interestingly, I think in-game betting is an area where people that don't have the time to devote to it could possibly do better. Now, here's the thing. With in-game betting, you have to be watching the game, or you at least have to be up have a nice feed of information about what's going on in the game. But in-game betting allows you to kind of just take the snapshots, the amount of time that's necessary in watching that game to formulate a bet to be made based on the lines that are constantly changing. And then the other nice thing about in-game betting is that it's a market where the sport book doesn't quite pick up how sharp you are right away. You can get a lot of leeway with in-game betting in winning wagers at a sports book before they say, oh, wait a minute, this guy's too sharp. Whereas if you're going ahead and just picking off every prop on the board, they're going to come to a realization pretty quick what you're there for. But in-game betting, it blends into the woodwork a little bit better. So that was it. That's a little shorter presentation this week in terms of what I had prepared. We're going to move into the Q&A section. And just a reminder, if you're in the Zoom room, you can go ahead and ask your question via the Q&A section. If you would like to try asking your question audibly, we can do the thing where you raise your hand. I'll enable the audio on your feed, and we can have a brief conversation with a question. I don't know, it hasn't seemed too popular outside of the time we did the live happy hour with Rufus and Spanky. But speaking of which, next week is going to be another live happy hour event. The guests I will be announcing on Monday. I think you're going to like them. These are two very knowledgeable people when it comes to sports betting. These are people we really don't get to hear from in detail too often. They don't have their own podcasts or anything, and they are very knowledgeable. And they're also sort of working in the industry somewhat as well. So there's some flavor there of them coming to it from a different angle as just us regular sports bettors are. All right, so I just need to rearrange some windows here to get the questions up and check out the chat. And no, it's not going to be Billy Walters next week. Somebody asked that in the chat. I wish, man, that would be a great get, huh? But no, not Billy Walters. Don't aim that high. Okay, so the first question we have coming in here is, it is, what are your plans for the future of when sports betting gets back? Are you still going to do these videos? Good question. I've been thinking a lot about that. I'm not crazy happy about the quality of these live streams yet. I think there's some more I can do with that. I think the bar is pretty low in terms of what's out there, but I think I can do better. What I'd like to see is I'd like to start doing more pre-recorded videos. Making the Modeler series has been well received. I can put other stuff. So what I kind of envision doing is once sports return and my time gets a little bit more taken by that, I'm going to do more pre-recorded videos, probably more like these topics, but in a pre-recorded form. So in other words, these 5 ways XYZ will be more of a pre-recorded. And then probably monthly, I'd like to do a live stream, a higher quality live stream. I think there's some ways I can kind of enhance this. So it's not just Zoom, but we can do something where there's more interaction between me and guests, as well as other sports bettors out there. And we can kind of gather once a month and just kind of, talk about the month that was, the month ahead, things like that. So I think that's where I'm headed with this channel. Still no plans to monetize it. I just don't feel that's necessary at this time. I enjoy what I'm doing. It's not making me any money. It's taking a lot of time, but at the same time, it's sort of fulfilling. I like when these things are done and when a new video gets posted. I feel like I just went 5-0 on a day of sports bets. So there's a good feeling behind it. Okay, so David asks, back in the day, we used Pinnacle as the sharp line to watch for moves. The thought was if we could beat the penny line, it was profitable bet since penny had the sharpest lines. Was there any validity to this back then or now? Okay, David, yes, absolutely. We all sort of did this, and many still do. Pinnacle was definitely the gold standard, the sharpest line on the board. My personal theory was if the take-back price at Pinnacle created an arb situation to the bet I wanted to make on the other side, I was definitely betting, that raw side at the non-Pinnacle book. But plenty of people also do sort of a no vig analysis with Pinnacle and say, if you're beating that line, then definitely it's a good bet many different ways. Here's the thing. Pinnacle has changed hands over the years. It's not the same shop it was 10, 20 years ago. there's been a little bit of a turnover in the people there. They still have many smart people, but some of the smartest people still working at Pinnacle. But I would say Chris is now the sharper book on the screen. Chris being bookmaker.eu for Americans that are playing offshore, BetChris for the rest of the world. Anyway, the point being is Chris is the sharpest guys in the room now. And they're the ones that, if you're going to take that approach, they're the book to look at. Okay, JJ asks, Jack, speaking to the time management end of things, what are your thoughts on adjusting your handicapping schedule to rush into MLB overnight lines versus taking more time in the AM, possibly missing juicy overnight? Oh, JJ, this is a really good point, and I probably should have put this in that whole understanding the market. So the market opens, we're talking baseball here. The market opens the day before, roughly around 3 p.m. If you're going to bet into those lines, you're going to affect the market. So if you're a sharp, and the limits are going to be low, by the way. So if you're going to bet into those lines, you're going to move the market. You're going to basically move the rest of the world when you're moving that market, and you're doing it all for peanuts. So even if you have an edge, sometimes waiting until the next day is better. Back when I was betting baseball more frequently, I could see the market inflection point of around 10 to 11 a.m. on the East Coast, and that was the Vegas books opening on the West Coast and some of the money moving in at that time into the market. Limits would increase around 10, 11 a.m. I could see lines start to move and start to adjust. So there's definitely an inflection point there. In my case, when I was betting enough that I could sneak in right before that 10, 11 point, get some bets down without causing too much ripple in the market. And then I could see which way the market went and then adjust my handicapping on a game based on that as the day went on, shortly after that 10, 11 a.m. point. But so that's a key point to make, JJ, is you don't want to wreck a market just because you want to get down your $250 bet. It's just not worth it to you in the long run, because if you are a winning bettor, you're only going to be increasing your bankroll and increasing your bet size as time goes on. And now you've kind of pigeonholed yourself into that. And you're also hurting all the rest of the market as well. And, I know you're not in this to make everybody else rich, but at the same time, when you cannibalize the market, you hurt yourself just as much as everybody else in the long run. And a quick follow-up here from JJ. He said, what level of bet triggers that issue on the overnights? Well, that's nuanced. I've seen books where on an overnight bet, if I bet $50, they move the line. It usually depends on who's betting into it. Generally, though, your limits on overnight lines rarely topped $500. I know Five Dimes used to talk about they took a 5-dime limit overnight lines. I don't know of anyone who ever successfully got down at that price for any amount of time. That was kind of a bait and switch. But generally, you're talking under $500 for a lot of these overnight lines. Overnight totals even less. So, and in most places, they're not even going to put up lines on the juicy overnight totals. So it's not the easiest place to be. All right, I'm going to go over to the YouTube chat here because it's been pretty active today. Thank you, guys. And I'm just going to see if I can pick out a question. Peter asks, when you all speak of offshore books, you are seldom mentioning any name except for Penny. Well, Penny is actually P-I-N-N-Y is kind of what we all refer to as Pinnacle. I don't really see a question there from Peter. Oh, could you give an opinion on Bovada? Well, Bovada is a recreational book. I live in New Jersey, and I cannot even get to Bovada's website anymore. Bovada has decided that in certain states where the state has made it clear that having an offshore book functioning in their state is illegal, they've pulled out of those states. So I haven't been on Bovada in years. They did this back in 2015. They pulled out of New Jersey. But when I played at Bovada, it was very square. You know, they have a square line and a sharp line, but it was still pretty square even with the sharp line. They offered a lot of props. They were kind of fun to play with sometimes. But once you hit a certain limit, you were done, and you weren't getting back in under your own name again. So they're not unlike many other Vegas books these days, right? You reach a point where you won enough from them, and they're no longer going to take your action. So in a way, they're not different than anybody else, other than that they target their recreational audience. Josh asks in the Zoom room here, hey, Jack, can someone limited to just betting in New Jersey make a living betting sports, in your opinion? Yeah, definitely, Josh. You know, I would like to think that I do okay with it. Not all of my action is solely in New Jersey, but I would say the vast majority of it is. Now, here's the thing. I got to operate a little bit leaner when I'm operating in New Jersey, and I'm operating under my own name. So what are the divisions of labor that I could possibly do to overcome that? Well, it would be to kind of take on some betting partners, or to, you know, kind of disguise my action by, you know, working with somebody else and having them place some bets sometimes. So there's some things you need to do there to kind of overcome the environment that you're in. But New Jersey does have something like 20 different sports books. It's a very good environment. You know, not all the sports books are great, but there's some good ones. There's supposedly more good ones coming in. New Jersey's a market where a lot of sports books look to prove themselves and get that stamp of approval. So we're going to see more operators come into the New Jersey market just as a way of proving their concept, even though it's an already saturated market. But I think the future of New Jersey sports betting is still looking pretty good. And then, of course, once Atlantic City opens back up again, then there's always the brick and mortar retail betting. Anonymous asks, is it worth small negative EV or break-even bets that look like sucker bets to maintain longevity? Does it make a difference on how your account looks? Same question for staying slightly under limits if you are a limit bettor. Well, here's my opinion on that. I think it does. I think books definitely profile you. However, avoiding their profile for too long is often not worth it or impossible to do. This is a good question to talk to a bookmaker about. My friend Pat Parada used to be at the resorts in Atlantic City as their head trader. He might even be on the stream here watching. So Pat, if you're watching and you want to chime in with that, let me know. If you want to hit me up on like WhatsApp or something to get your answer through quicker, go ahead and do that. But anyway, I would imagine that yes, it is somewhat effective to place small negative EV bets or place break-even bets in order to make yourself look better. But of course, you know, it's the old thing with card counting. It's like, yeah, you can bet $5 at a table playing blackjack, and then when the count gets good, you can bet $100. That's going to stick out, right? So if you're betting small into these negative EV bets, and then all of a sudden you're betting max bet on some game where you have an advantage or a prop or something like that, you know, it's going to stick out pretty fast. Okay, another question here. In regards to time management, if you're a college football player like myself, the games are fairly late on Saturday and lines open on Sunday morning. Any advice for processing Saturday's results in time for Sunday's openers? Don't sleep, question mark. Well, yeah, you know, that's tough. I've always found college sports to be very tough to be a solid handicapper for, because there's just so many variables. There's so many teams, and the amount of information on those teams is just not uniform across the entire Division One, FBS and FCS and all those Division III and things like that. So yes, I think it is definitely harder to do handicapping of the West Coast and Hawaii games teams come the line openers on Sunday morning. The good news is that a lot of people that are coming up with those lines may not have slept either, or may not want to put those lines up right away. So if you put in the extra effort, there might be a uneven scale there when it comes to the advantage you can get based on how the line opens and things like that. I don't know. That's just speculation on my part. But honestly, that's tough. If you're betting or watching those late games, trying to process everything that happened, and in terms for those early Sunday morning line openers, it can definitely be tough. All right, let me hop over here to YouTube again and see if I can get another question from then. Hey, the chat's been great in YouTube. I'm going to definitely be checking out this chat after this is done. Okay, Nemanja had a question and wanted to know. Just trying to find what Nemanja's question was. Okay, I believe here's the question from Nemanja. Margins are pretty thin and turnover is very important. How do you manage to get high stakes? If you bet small, there is no point in that. What is your idea on how to get decent returns? So this is the art of sports betting. Okay, so we can talk about the science of sports betting all you want, and we can talk about the different ways to handicap things like that. But the art of sports betting is actually getting the money down. That's stuff that I'm not too comfortable sharing on the stream or onto YouTube in a unedited form, just because I don't want to say too much and I don't want to give away things that I might not want to give away. But here's the thing, you got to approach it as an art form. And when you approach it as an art form, that means there's no real one way to do something. You have many different ways that you can approach it and handle it and twist it and turn it and shape it into what you need it to be. So you think creatively when it comes to getting your money down and practicing the art of sports betting. Sorry, I can't be too much more giving with that. Maybe in a pre-recorded video, I'll have a better way to say it that gives enough away, but not too much. Bax Sports asks, is it worth reading into line movements for obscure leagues and props? In other words, does closing line value exist for that kind of thing? Okay, so closing line value for props is pretty unexistent. It's just not worth trying to follow because prop lines are going to move too much. They're going to zip and zag all over the place. And especially since there's no real Don Best screen for props, what book do you follow, to get that closing line value? It gets pretty complicated. So what I will say is that if you're doing an obscure league or you're doing props, you're not using closing line value to evaluate yourself as much as you're using pretty much your own experiences and your own results-driven results in your process. So I wouldn't focus too much on the metrics of how to win when it comes to betting props, because sometimes those markets are just so soft in the first place. You don't need to worry about all of that. Your monetary result will bear that out, and you're not really able to bet all that much anyway. So it might not even be worth all the complicated calculations to figure out if you have an edge or not. You just go ahead and bet it, and if you're not doing well, you figure out a way to do it better. Props don't need to be too difficult, and that's why they're something that is very good when you have limited time. Okay, I remember somebody told me that when I am doing this Q&A, I should stop the screen sharing so people can actually see what I look like and I'm not just a small box in the corner. So I'll go ahead and do that. I shaved my beard. I just wasn't feeling the beard anymore. It's just too scratchy, and it was salt and pepper with a little too much salt, not enough pepper. So shave that off. Still really need a haircut, but I'm trying to do best I can. Okay, back to some questions here. Some more Q&A from the Zoom room. Nobody wants to try to do a audio call. That's okay. I don't mind. Okay, what are the advantages and disadvantages of tackling less popular markets such as NASCAR? Stuart asked this. So Stuart, NASCAR is, man, I went through a phase where I was handicapping NASCAR, and then I started to do NASCAR DFS. And it was one of the most frustrating experiences, because here's the thing. there's a lot of drivers in NASCAR. There's maybe 40 plus drivers in a race. There's not a lot of variance in NASCAR. The 10 good drivers are the 10 good drivers, and the guys at the back of the field have very little chance of winning the race. And that seems to repeat itself every week. And when you go into like NASCAR DFS, and they have different metrics for points, whereas, you know, how many cars do they pass, and then you have to take into account the type of track. Is it going to be easy for passing, harder for passing? Anyway, it becomes more of a solved sport than you would think it would be. You know, you think auto racing, it's going to be kind of haphazard. There's crashes, there's, you know, things go wrong with the car. But it's not. It seems to be a very solved sport. It felt like I was playing limit poker. You know, there was just a lot of times when I just feel like this game's solved and everyone knows the answer. And the thing that made me give up on NASCAR betting is I had a DFS where it was a 50-50. So I just needed to finish in the top 50 percentile in order to cash out, you know, to win the match. And I finished within, I think, 7 points of the leader. And I think the maximum points you could get was 248 at that time in DraftKings NASCAR, if I'm remembering the numbers correctly. But I was only 7 points off the leader, and I was not in the top 50 percentile of the massive group 50-50. Everybody knew the same answers. You know, everybody followed the same people on Twitter that were giving advice on NASCAR. It was too congested of a field. So I went off on a tangent there on NASCAR. You were really asking about less popular markets. I do think there's benefits in trying to handle less popular markets. NASCAR maybe not so much, but WNBA is profitable for a lot of people. You know, look at this Korean baseball. I know a lot of people that focus on minor league baseball or international leagues of baseball, and they see this Korean baseball as, you know, just another one of those, and they're doing pretty well with it. So yeah, there's definitely ways that you can approach sports betting with less popular leagues, maybe get some of that data out there that not everyone's seeing, or catch some of the lines makers that are kind of sleeping on the job when it comes to these other leagues and some of the conditions they're played in. So yeah, I think looking at other leagues is definitely something worth doing. J.A. asks, Sports Insights has a tool that shows number of bets percentages for each team and money percentage distribution for the same game. Number one, do you believe in these numbers? Not really. Number two, do you use these stats to determine a bet you're going to make? Yeah, here's the thing with these bet percentages is we don't know exactly who, what, how, where. You know, I trust them probably more from Sports Insights than I trust from a single bookmaker who puts them up on Twitter. You know, like they might say, oh, look, 68% of our tickets and 72% of the money are on this. I don't really trust that. Not that I think they're fabricating those numbers. It's just that that's a single slice. That, you know, the sharp money may not be playing this game at William Hill because William Hill has hung a line that is not advantageous to sharps all week. So this is all just square money, and what's the source of this? We don't really know. Same thing with like Sports Insights. You know, what's their source? How balanced is it? How much does it understand the dynamics of the sharp money coming in, or where the sharp money is? And again, it's like, at what line is this all played at? You know, so in other words, 68% of the money could be on the Bears, but did they get down at -2.5 and now the world's at -3, or did they get down at -3 and the world's at -3? You know, there's a lot of dynamics there we don't understand when we see those things, and sometimes that's more noise than signal. So I wouldn't use much trust into those, and I wouldn't use them to determine where the public's at or how the public's playing or if there's an inefficiency in a line. Okay, Sharp High Fade. That might not be your real name. Regarding the market, let's say you make a number -125. The market opens at -110 and eventually moves to +100. Would you avoid this bet? Would I avoid it? I don't have enough information just based on that to say that I would avoid it. But at the same time, it may be time to double check your numbers if the market's moving. Now that, in my opinion, is not a big market move. -125, -110 to +100 is not often a big enough market move. However, if that was minus 110, meaning the game was pretty much a pick 'em, and now the other team is heavily favored, let's say minus 120, 125, whatever, that's when you start to get to the point where it could be a situation you might have missed something. And that's what you need to do when the market is moving, is you need to identify, what does the market know that I might not know? Yes, sometimes you're right and the market is wrong. However, in the long run, on the grand scale, no, the market's going to be right more times than you are. David asked, what's the deal with pending Major League Baseball futures tickets? It depends on what you wagered. We don't know enough yet to know if what wagers are going to be refunded. However, if you wagered on season wins and they're not going to play a full 162 game season, which they're probably not, those will be refunded. If you wagered on who will win the World Series and they still play some of a season and have a playoffs and have World Series, then those are still standing. But they're not going to refund those tickets until they know exactly what's going to happen. Same with the NBA. There's a lot of people with pending NBA tickets out there that are still kind of wondering what's going to happen there. Heading back over here to YouTube. Ryan asks, I was hoping to get your advice on beating props. Would you recommend modeling or using the sharp books to find square books that haven't adjusted? Also, what offshore books do you recommend for props? So, look, props are tough. Props are one of those art forms. Props are beatable. Can you model with props? Yes. And in fact, that's probably a good way to do it, is to do modeling with props. But at the same time, you don't necessarily need to use just modeling. You can sometimes come up with a better approximation of a number and then, use a Poisson distribution or even a normal distribution in some cases to find out how much the line is off by and to approach it that way. Props are a great low-hanging fruit for beginning bettors. And definitely, if you're a beginning bettor, you definitely want to be approaching props, looking at props, betting props. I cut my teeth betting props. I made some good money betting props offshore back 2004, 2008, around there. But at the same time, books get tired of you betting props. They don't like you betting props. They know that props are largely a loss leader for them. They're there to get you in the door. So if you're just betting props, you can expect the book to take a countermeasure against you in some way. And so you got to weigh that into consideration as to how heavily you want to take on props. Now, is there a sharp market for props that you can use to bet against the other ones? It's tough to say. Here's something I'll share, though. These aren't offshore books. These are legal books. But FanDuel and DraftKings, they're DFS houses, right? So you figure they probably have some guys on staff that can create a good prop line. DraftKings, though, they use Kambi to make their lines, and DraftKings props are pretty soft. FanDuel, on the other hand, they clearly use a lot of their own lines makers when it comes to props, and their props are usually a little bit sharper. So I can play DraftKings against FanDuel. Now, here's the thing. Once you bet a few props at DraftKings, you're going to be limited down to $50 or less, but you can take it while you can get it there at DraftKings, because they're not as sharp with the props as FanDuel is. Okay, back over here to YouTube. Got about 10 more minutes here on our hour, and so we'll get some of the questions. I'm just going to go back, see if there's any questions I missed. AP, I like that, AP, asks, how do you cope with telling people that you are a sports gambler with the stigma? Yeah, I went through that for a while. I would tell people I was just a computer consultant. When I left my full-time job 8 years ago or so, I was working in IT at a law firm, and I told people I'm going to be an IT consultant for smaller law firms. And I actually did some of that work, sort of on the side. But now I'm pretty upfront with it that I am a professional gambler. I don't think there's as much a stigma involved with it anymore. The only thing I get a lot is, oh, that means you play poker. I don't play poker. I'm not a great poker player. Um, at least in New Jersey now, I can say, oh, we have legal sports betting. I do legal sports betting. And that usually they go, oh, sports betting. Oh, that's kind of cool. And they want to know more about it. But in the past, when I was more a casino-based AP, I was very secretive with what I was doing, and I didn't want to talk about what I was doing. So if somebody said something, I said, yeah, I'm doing that. So if they said, oh, poker, I go, yeah. If they said, oh, you're a card counter, I go, yeah, I'm a card counter. I wasn't counting any cards, but the point being is I didn't want to divulge too much, and I still don't. I still don't like to be too upfront on exactly what I'm doing, where I'm doing it, when I'm doing it. This step into kind of doing these live streams, putting my face out there, was a big step, and it was definitely kind of thought over many, many months before I actually did it. Shane asks, do you utilize any European sports books, and if you get better prices sometimes? So, well, I mean, by European sports books, in New Jersey, we have a lot of the European model of sports books. Their lines are originating in Europe in a lot of cases, but I don't actually play over in Europe. I don't have any teammates over there getting down for me in Europe. I have in the past used people in other countries. Australia was good for a while. Asian countries are usually pretty good. There's a lot high tolerance for big action in Asian countries. But facilitating moving money around the world and things like that, it just gets to be a pain. The lags in time with communication, it gets to be a pain. So usually those partnerships are only for a certain angle, and then you move on from it. Back to the Q&A on Zoom for a couple more questions before we wrap up. Have you heard anything about any movement with regards to legislation in Arizona? So Arizona is one state. This was a question from Adam. Thanks, Adam. Arizona is one state where they are still pursuing possible legislation. There was a kind of exploratory bill out there. But here's the thing, Arizona is one of those states where you have a lot of tribal gaming. And what we've seen in states where you have tribal gaming is it's hard to get an agreement when it comes to what kind of gaming will be offered in terms of sports betting. Michigan's the only one I can think of so far that's done it pretty well. And we've yet to really see how well they've done it. They launched literally the day sports shut down. But, some other states, Washington launched it and they only gave it to tribal gaming, and they didn't do any mobile betting, and it's going to be a disaster. We've had California, which looks like they'll never come to an agreement between the card rooms and the tribal casinos. Florida's a huge mess because of tribal gaming. The tribal gaming, they're just not reasonable with a lot of things that they do in how they approach gaming in general, let alone sports betting. They don't understand it. It's one of these things I'd like to see change. Well, I wish I could use American Bettors Coalition and use that to help change that. But the tribal gaming lobby is very strong, very organized, and it's also very cohesive in how the tribes kind of stick together. And that doesn't play well for open competitive sports betting. So I don't have much hope that there will ever be good sports betting in states that have a majority of tribal gaming, unfortunately. Okay. Maybe another question for a bookmaker, but do you think running a significant amount of money through at a table game, say at a 0.5% house edge, is better and can give you significant leeway in a book? Well, sort of, yes. So I have experienced leeway in books where I have done some betting in their casino. I maybe do some low edge video poker play. But here's the thing, they kind of see through that too. Now, I try to attempt this with DraftKings. I offered on Twitter, I said, I'll give them $100,000 of coin in a month in video poker if they'll let me bet with $500 limits in their sports book. And no, they didn't take that deal. Honestly, that would be a good deal for them, but they didn't take it. So it depends on the book. Your mileage may vary with that, but it's a good way to think about it. Anonymous that asked this question. It's definitely a possibility. Jay Rose on YouTube asks, do you think DraftKings would be a good investment? Personal feelings aside on how DraftKings has treated me, the DraftKings investment is very curious, because basically what is happening right now is, if you add up the market capital that is implied by the stock price, they're making DraftKings to be a 12 to 15 billion dollar company. Whereas if you look at a company like Flutter, who owns FanDuel, and they own Betfair, and they own TVG, and they own all these gaming brands, they own Paddy Power, they own the Stars Group now, they're valued at like 10 to 12 billion. So now DraftKings, this one company in the US that has yet to turn a profit, is valued at more than this company that's a multinational corporation with all these different brands and established footholds in all these different places. And when they go head to head, FanDuel and DraftKings, FanDuel seems to be winning the battle whenever they're in head to head in a state. So you add that all up and something doesn't make sense with the valuation. Now, if you look at the stock price and the metrics of DraftKings, you're going to see that there's a key metric there, and that is percentage that is held by institutions. In other words, institutional investors, hedge funds, mutual funds, investment banks. Well, that investment on a lot of companies is north of 50%. However, with DraftKings, it is 10%. So 90% of this company is being held by retail investors. I think that's a huge warning sign. The market in general, I'm not going to go into finance and financial politics and macroeconomics, but the market in general is a little bit scary at this point. And when you see something that's 90% retail investors, people that are just holding, 100 shares or less of the company, that shows you there's a lot of fluff into that. That's a lot of people that are believing into something that might not be totally sustainable or based on financial information. So am I shorting DraftKings right now? No, I'm not that confident in it. I just don't see the valuation being what it is, and I don't see it going wildly north of this either. Eventually, the shorts do come into play. If you ever seen the movie The Big Short, that kind of reminds me here. This is an irrational pump up in the pricing, and eventually somebody will come in and take advantage of that. Real quick, a couple other questions here. We'll wrap it up. Scott Hoffman. Hey, Scott. Good to see you on here. Off topic a bit, but have you heard of high-level DFS players getting bigger sports betting limits on DraftKings? No, I haven't heard that. I'm pretty sure that, all these sports books have VIP players. We see that there are large bets being made. They're not being made by me. They're not being made by you. But they're made so that people can, post about it on Twitter and say, we just took $100,000 on this and that. Fine. That's your way of doing publicity. Fine. But for bettors like you and I, we're not getting into these VIP clubs of being able to bet big. Now, maybe there are some big high DFS players that can do it. If I was a sports book, I'm not sure I'd want to put a high profit DFS player into that. I want to maybe put a high losing DFS player into a VIP circle. But that's the way the casino industry has always worked. I'm not going to begrudge them on that. But it is what it is. Okay, I'm going to try to wrap up the last couple questions here as we wrap up the hour. Thanks again for everyone that's joined me today. Hit that like button if you're on YouTube, and subscribe if you can. And everyone that's been in the Zoom room, I really appreciate the way you ask these questions, and it's been a good experience. Casey asks, if you wanted to monitor the Asian market, is there a Don Best type screen that you could recommend? I don't know of one that is focused just on the Asian market. Here's the thing: the Asian market is largely a dark market. It's look, there's tons of betting in China, but no one's going to say, oh, we're a big sports book in China. That'd be suicide for them to come out and admit that. But there's tons of betting in places like China and Iran and Turkey and Russia. But no one's going to freely admit to it. So the odds of there being a Don Best screen profiling it all are very slim. However, I'm sure the Don Best screen is adhered to even in Asia, and the market price is the market price around the world. Okay, well, I think that just about does it. Oh, Carlos had asked, what's the ticker on DraftKings? It is DKNG. Always reminds me of Donkey Kong when I see it, and that's kind of fitting. But DKNG is the ticker for DraftKings. So I want to thank you all for coming in here today and joining me. Next week, again, we're going to have a happy hour with 2 guests, and the guests are going to be pretty good. I think you're really going to enjoy it. I'll be announcing that on Twitter. And until then, thank you all, and I'll see you next time. Good night.